ل1300-976-481 أو على موقعنا mysat.com.au.
Are you thinking of building your dream home but don't know where to begin? Well, look no further. With 25 years of experience, Choice Building Constructions can get any job done when it comes to new homes, renovations, extensions, building repairs, pergolas, fencing and gates, painting, first floor additions, concreting, and so much more. For more information, contact George Boutros on 0416 042 226 and let Choice Building Constructions help you build the dream home you've always wanted. Old Time Bakery is proud to announce the release of the first gluten-free Lebanese bread to hit the market, specializing in gluten-free wraps and pizza bases. For more information, please contact Old Time Bakery on 9708 4442 or visit their website on www.oldtimebakery.com.au. The Voice of Charity would like to thank our current sponsors for their ongoing support. And if you would like to become one of our sponsors, please contact the Voice of Charity office on 9625 6111 or email us on voc@voc.org.au.
علمتينا المحبة سمعتينا حبي حبي علمتينا المحبة لتخافي من هبوب الريح عن حبك ما رح ننسي لتخافي من هبوب الريح عن حبك ما رح ننسي صوتك من صوت المسيح تبقي صوت المحبة.
In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity. Welcome back to another week on the Catholic Toolbox, the Art of Practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa, here as we equip you with practical tools to live the Catholic faith in our modern world of today. And this week, we mourn the loss of our former Holy Father, Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. And welcome aboard here today, Reverend Father John Flader, welcome aboard, and Jordan Grantham here to the show. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, George.
Thank you for being with me. It was such a shock, actually. It was celebrating New Year's Eve. Jordan walked in. We're celebrating New Year's Eve and brought the news of the passing of our former Holy Father, and it was a great sadness. Pope Benedict meant a lot to me personally, and helped me in the journey of my faith by reading his works and looking at his example. But for those listeners, Pope Benedict was born Joseph Aloysius Ratzinger on April 16th, 1927 in Markto am Inn, Bavaria, Germany. He was ordained a priest in 1951 and went on to become Archbishop of Munich and Freising. and then was summoned by Pope John Paul II to become prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and also the president of the Pontifical Biblical Commission in 2005. He was elected Pope in the year 2005. And during his papacy, he worked to restore the liturgy, promote the faith, and there's a lot we have to say here. There's a lot we have to discuss about his life, his great legacy that he's left for us as the church, and how it's going to be felt into the future. I don't know where to start. Father, if you lead us in the discussion, who was Pope Benedict to you personally? And let's start with that.
Okay, for me personally, I never met him. I never met a pope. Every priest I know has a photograph of himself with a pope, and I don't have any. I got close to some with John Paul II, for example, in the celebrated Mass in Canberra when he was here in '86, and with Pope Benedict as Cardinal Ratzinger. I never met him, but everybody who did meet him says he was a very shy, humble, very affable, open person. People that I worked with at times who met him in St. Peter's Square when they were just crossing the path, and he would stop and give them the time of day, be very friendly with them. And I was just reading a letter from the prelate of Opus Dei, Monsignor Fernando O'Cardiff, who worked as a consultor on the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith with Cardinal Ratzinger at the time. And he had some reminiscences about the sort of person he was. He said he was with him alone on a good number of occasions. And the things that struck him, amongst them were these, that he said he was very welcoming. He gave you the time of day. He wanted to listen to you. And he said the Cardinal Ratzinger was not the one to end the conversation, to say, I think I've got to go and do something else now. He listened until the other person had finished. And he said, even if the viewpoint that you were expressing was different from his, he wanted to hear it. He was not closed and wanted to hear only someone that would agree with what he had said. He wanted to hear the truth. He was a man in search of the truth. And if somebody expressed a contrary opinion, he wanted to hear it. Then, as we know, towards the end of his life, or not the end of his life, towards the end of his time as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, on several occasions, he put in his resignation to Pope John Paul II, asking to resign so that someone younger with more vitality could take over that role. And he could go back to Germany and pray and study. This was his ambition. And the Pope always refused the resignation. And then, to his great, I suspect, chagrin, Pope Benedict found himself being elected Pope in 2005 and wanted to go back and retire, but now he's in the leadership of the largest organization in the world and probably the largest organization in history. 1.3 billion faithful, and I believe it may have just passed 1.4. So someone like that, shy, retiring, humble, scholarly, open to people, now finds himself Pope and having to govern the universal church. And I suspect that in the years that he was doing that, with all the issues that he was facing, he probably got to a point where his health was failing, he was getting older, and he just decided, it's time, let someone else younger do this job. And then he put in that resignation that we all found so surprising, first time in 600 years. But an extraordinary man, a great theologian, probably the best or one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century. And then his writings, that's another thing that always struck me. Deep ideas in simple language.
And I'm sorry, Father, you did freeze for a little bit there. But I think what you said still made a great deal of sense and was very articulately put, and probably a fairly natural segue to my appreciation of Benedict XVI. He could put complex ideas into completely clear language. And I wonder if that, I'm no expert on Benedict XVI, the Catholic faith or anything. However, I have worked for many Catholic organizations at fairly senior levels. And I suspect Pope Benedict's beautiful writing and the spirit that filled them came from John Henry Newman's phrase of heart speaks to heart, or at least that was a saying that meant a great deal to St. John Henry Newman, of whom Pope Benedict was a deep admirer and the one who certainly beatified him on his incredible state visit to the United Kingdom. And Benedict XVI has been speaking to my heart for probably 12 or 13 years now. And I wrote an article or a bit of a review years ago about his interview book with Peter Seebold, the journalist. And after I wrote that review for a diocesan publication in Australia, someone said to me, Jordan, it sounds like you're in love with Pope Benedict, or Pope Emeritus Benedict as he was back then. And I guess that's true. This is someone I deeply revere as a spiritual father to everyone before his papacy, during his papacy, and in some surprising ways afterwards as well. So the love of the faith shines through in everything he does and says. Like you were saying, Father Flader, he was a humble, softly spoken man. And I think there's great beauty in being a man of few words, in that, or not few words, but of carefully chosen words, in that each of them hopefully has profound meaning, as I think they did with Pope Benedict. And his Wednesday audiences were a great example of his pontificate being a real teaching papacy. He would point to others who were great minds or greater minds in the faith, the doctors of the church very often. And so I think the method of his theology and the content were clearly one, in that he was in conformity with these greater minds, and he was doing that with his study and his exploration of the church's beautiful teachings with humility and as a form of prayer, which as an Augustinian, maybe one of the very few or recent popes since St. Thomas Aquinas to be an Augustinian rather than a Thomist, I think is quite appropriate because of St. Augustine's great points about theology as prayer and doing theology from within the church. And I think something that might be a little bit overlooked in journalistic commentary and other evaluations of his leadership as Pope is actually his leadership in the church through the Holy Office, or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I think it's now called the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith, in that he was the prefect for a very significant period of time and a very productive period of time under Saint Pope John Paul II. So it was a time of great upheaval. Many theologians who had official positions, chairs of Catholic theology. We look at Catholic University of America and what was happening in the faculty there. Also in Europe, where the state will mandate that, there has to be a Catholic theology department and a Protestant or Lutheran theology department. And Catholic theologians, so-called, were getting carried away wildly and not doing theology, faithfully and from within the church, thinking with the mind of the church. And so Pope Benedict's, then Cardinal Ratzinger's work to pastor and try to guide people back into the mind of the church would have been a very difficult task, I think, in a practical sense, but theologically also very significant, if probably less challenging, because the faith, she speaks for herself. So documents like Dominus Jesus was very significant, and so many important letters that came out from the important documents that came from the CDF have been very influential to the study and understanding of Catholic theology in the second half of the 20th century, and people forget about that a little bit. Sorry, George.
It's interesting that you mentioned there about his role at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. I can't but help but harken back to the 60s, where the student upheaval and the student revolutions were going on, where the students there was a lot of student upheavals, there was a lot of change there. And it was there that I believe then young Professor Joseph Ratzinger was friends with then Hans Kung. So I think the early Ratzinger wasn't that conservative that we knew after he had moved to the University of Regensburg and had obtained a professorship there. I think that's where he sort of shifted more into seeking the truth, if that's correct.
George, just one comment on that I read when people were accusing him of just what you said, that he had shifted. He was a more liberal-minded, to use that term, theologian in the beginning, along with the others in that magazine Concilium, and then he shifted more to the right, to use that terminology, which it's I guess it's one way of making oneself understood. These terms are political; they don't apply to the church. But his answer to that was, he said, "I didn't change my views; the others did. We were all together in that magazine Concilium." And then they shifted more towards ideas that he did not espouse, that were not consistent with the tradition of the church over 2,000 years. So he said, I stayed where I was, and that led to the magazine Communio, which he was then involved in very much. So there were these European theologians that had a lot to do with Vatican II. And Cardinal Pell, in his long article on the webpage, at least, of the Australian this past weekend, said that he, Cardinal Ratzinger at the time, a young theologian, was one of the experts for Cardinal Frings from, I think he was from Munich as well. And so these theologians were having a great influence in the bishops and the cardinals to get certain new ideas into the magisterium of the church through the council. And Cardinal Pell says that, then later Cardinal Ratzinger and Pope Benedict was a very influential one in steering the council in keeping with the tradition towards a more modern approach to it and an opening to the world, as we see in Gaudium et Spes and other documents. The council was momentous, probably, as Cardinal Pell says, the most significant event in the history of the church of the 20th century. And somebody like Ratzinger had a great influence on it, as did other theologians like Dillobach and others, French, that I don't think of the names at the moment. But yeah, very influential in the church. Actually, one of the things too that I think we should all expect and maybe hope for is his eventual process of beatification and canonization. I think he's a saint. He's a man of God. He's a man of prayer. And that came through so clearly in his very approach to ideas and his way of speaking and preaching in masses and his humility. And I think that the opening of his cause would be to be expected in due course. Maybe not Santo Subito, as we heard of John Paul II in his very funeral mass although we might hear it again on Thursday. But a great Pope, a great contributor to the history of the Church in the 20th century.
I think from a millennial perspective, I think we would say that Pope Benedict was extremely relevant to young people. I mean, one of the greatest contributions that I love was the liturgical one that he gave us. And he gave to many young people, because many young people appreciate this, and many other people in the church, was Summorum Pontificum. I think many people rejoiced at that. What are your thoughts, Jordan, on Summorum Pontificum?
Who are you asking? If you ask me, I have been close to a good number of priests who are saying the traditional Latin Mass, and I sympathize totally with them. And I was very heartened to see what Pope Benedict did in that document in opening up that Mass to any priest who wanted to say it. He didn't need special permissions. Now it seems that that door is being gently closed, although we have to see what the next Pope will do with that. I personally think we might see an opening of the door a bit wider in the future, because what we're seeing is that in around the world, the number of people attending that Mass, and these are young people in the main, people who are not exposed to the Tridentine Rite Mass that I was when I was growing up serving that Mass. I was exposed to it. Personally, I don't know how to say it now. I haven't learned it. And at my age, I probably won't. But young people are seeing in that Mass reverence, beauty. And I think it's part of the Church. It was part of the Church's liturgy for all those years. And I think it must remain. And maybe the Novus Ordo can be revised too, to be more reverential, though it depends on each priest. I think a priest can say that Mass very, very well and with great reverence, and people are moved by the Novus Ordo Mass as well. But I was grateful to Pope Benedict for giving us that document, Summorum Pontificum, and we pray that in the future the access to the Mass will be what it was under Pope Benedict.
That's right, and I have a similar reaction to you, Father, in that I think this the extraordinary form, as Summorum Pontificum called the traditional Latin Mass, is such a treasure of our faith. I have a bit of a background in public relations and marketing and whatnot, and the great thing about going to a Latin Mass is you don't feel and I think Sheila Booth, recent Hollywood convert, said you don't feel like someone's trying to sell you something when you go to the Latin Mass. And I don't think that's inherent to the Novus Ordo. However, there is something special about how the rubrics of the Latin Mass have that otherworldliness very strictly written into it. And discipline is a good thing. And I think young people in a very different world to into 1927, when Joseph Ratzinger was born, almost the opposite level of discipline and hierarchy. Young people are looking for rules, for meaning, for solidity, for substance. You can't have substance without form. So I think we really should be very grateful to Pope Benedict, and that probably is the unstoppable snowball effect that Pope Benedict liberated amongst the young clergy around the world. And I think a very small percentage of young seminarians today would not have some interest in the Latin Mass, whereas that would have been a very different scenario even 10 or 20 years ago.
And I think to add to what you're saying, Jordan, I think we can actually say that he was instrumental in founding the priestly fraternity of St. Peter, which is
really,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's very much involved in setting them up, working with them to set up a seminary in Germany, in the United States. So it's very instrumental. I mean, in the whole process, from what I heard, especially I was reading that throughout the week, and I think we have much to be grateful from Pope Benedict for liberating the 1962 missal for us all.
Could I say one more thing about young people related to that? Where my love for Pope Benedict began was reading in George Weigel's book, God's Choice, about Pope Benedict's election. That anecdote of him as a forced recruit in the during the Second World War in Germany, and a really moving, dramatic scene you could put in a film. And here's the teenaged Joseph Ratzinger lined up with these other German-sold conscripts, and some SS officer is inspecting the unit and asks each of them, well, what do you want to be when you're in the future? What do you aspire to achieve? And they were saying things like, well, I want to fight for the Führer, and I want to be an SS, in the SS like you one day. And so there was that clear dynamic and great social pressure. But instead of saying what the superior wanted to hear, he came forward and he said, well, I want to be a priest in the future. And I think the sincerity, the bravery, the tenderness of that speaks to a lot of people. And I think your adolescence is a formative time for most people's identity, and seeing the courage that he had for his faith, which was being attacked in Germany, obviously, under the regime there. He, I think, has an appreciation for young people in a secular regime. There's that great phrase of his, the dictatorship of relativism, which I think he's popularized more than any other. And I think his sympathy for young people under that dictatorship is probably formed in his own experiences of dictatorship.
So we've spoken about the tremendous liturgical legacy that Pope Benedict has left us. And I mean, even though Summorum Pontificum was somewhat, suppressed with Traditionis Custodes, I think the effects have taken place for the coming generations, and the growth and the appreciation of the liturgy through the Latin Mass. But let's speak about the theological legacy. As one of the greatest theologians of our time, one of the greatest minds, in my opinion, and has personally touched me. Pope Benedict, during the time when I was rediscovering my faith in the year 2009, when I was in grade 9, I read some of the works of Cardinal Ratzinger, like the Ratzinger reports, I think in that particular year, I remember reading some of his works. Especially it was the Ratzinger report that really got me there, and I started to really watch and appreciate Cardinal Ratzinger and some of his works. But let's speak about Father. Let's speak a little bit about the theological legacy that he's left us. And I can't think of anything better than to speak about his trilogy, Jesus of Nazareth. Just a spectacular piece of work there.
Yes. Well, I think before we get into that, it would be worth mentioning that the works of Ratzinger are being published in German and I suppose eventually translated into other languages. But it's a momentous amount of writing that he has done. Cardinal Pell, in his article on the weekend, was saying he thought he had read all of his works, and then he came across a whole series of other ones that he hadn't read. And so I think Jesus of Nazareth is small, sitting on top of that mountain of works that he's done of deep theology. But Jesus of Nazareth is for the people. And I think anyone that's read it, and I hope we all have, just benefits so much from the Gospels come to life in that work as he goes through the life of Christ. And of course, the last volume to appear was the first one in chronological order, the infancy. And unfortunately, it's the shortest. One wishes that it were a little bit longer. But I found just reading that work a great document for spiritual reading. and finding out more of Christ. And one of the things that I was preaching about just recently with Christmas was his reflection on the swaddling cloths that wrapped our Lord in the crib, in the manger. And he said, those swaddling cloths, and let me describe how they saw them in the early church. And when you have icons of the nativity scene, you see this little infant wrapped round and round a narrow band of cloth, maybe starting from the head or starting from the feet and just going all the way around the body with the limbs, especially the arms alongside the body, so that it looked like a mummy. And then Cardinal Ratzinger's reflection on that is those swaddling cloths prefigured the shroud that wrapped him in the tomb. As an infant, he was born for this. He was born to die for us on the cross, to redeem us. And even the swaddling cloths prefigure what was going to happen later after he had died. Just a little reflection like that I found very insightful and very helpful in understanding the infant Jesus. He's come for something greater than just being born. He was here as our God, as our brother, and as our Redeemer.
And I mean, it's just spectacular. I mean, one of my favorite works is Christianity and the Crisis of Cultures. I mean, that was where he spoke about Europe and the decline of Christian practice in Europe. Now you're nodding your head there, Jordan. I'm sure you have something to say there about that. But that was just a spectacular book. I love that. I soaked it in about a day and a half. Just his perspective on the decline of faith and the crisis of cultures. But what are your thoughts, Jordan, on that particular aspect?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that is going to be a massive part of Pope Benedict's legacy in underlining the importance and the need for re-evangelization in Europe. I think it's very interesting that a new Benedictine community has been formed in Nursia, again, Saint Benedict's birthplace, a community which greatly loves the liturgy. I'm pretty sure it's only the Latin Mass, or mostly the Latin Mass. I'm not completely across that, but I just think that probably wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the measures we discussed earlier and the leadership taken to open up or reopen that beautiful treasure of the faith in terms of the liturgy. And I think his incredible intellectual rigor and background is also symptomatic of his Europeanness. And Germany, one of the most scholarly countries and cultures in Europe, where learning has huge esteem in the culture there, and there, even since the 19th century, their academia has been respected, at least for its extensiveness and its approaches to having a rigorous form of academia, more so than maybe some other cultures at that time in history when they gained that reputation. So I think his approach to culture and sociality should also be recognized. He's sometimes portrayed as purely this very quiet, gentle Christian gentleman, but he also was a social and man who had a joy for life. He had a profound love of Mozart, and I believe it was Mozart's clarinet concerto that was his favorite piece of music. And he was instrumental in bringing one of the German Catholic student fraternities to Rome. And I've forgotten exactly its name, but these are very fun, lively, culture and life-affirming sorts of societies. They're drinking beer and singing songs is a large part of what they do, but they also support the community. support each other in faith, and pass on important traditions and academic traditions as well. So I think that should be remembered. My background is actually the Shrine of Altötting in Bavaria, which is the main, sort of the Lourdes of Bavaria, the main Marian shrine there. And so very close to where Pope Benedict was born. And I think that is going to be a real turning point in the future of Western civilization, whether Europe rediscovers her roots. And the main person to really bring it to our attention in the latter half of the 20th century and early 20th century has been Benedict XVI. He made huge attempts to build bridges in Europe in his visits to Germany, his speeches and letters to the European Union, all of which I believe were not very warmly received, were very coldly rebuffed by most leading members of those political unions. So I do hope that his passing is a time for reflection for leaders in Europe and especially Germany, because without the faith, by cutting ourselves off from the vine, we do wither. And I hope Europe rediscovers her identity in Christ in a much more profound way than has happened for centuries.
I mean, what's tattooed in my mind is the famous speech that he gave to the College of Cardinals before they went into the conclave. And he said this, we are building a dictatorship of relativism, which does not recognize anything as definitive, which solely consists of one's own ego and desires. Close quote. Mm-hmm. What do we think of what he just said there? A dictatorship of relativism.
Well, it really goes back to the nature of sin, and I'm probably stealing the limelight from Father, who is has much more expertise on the problems of virtue and growth in virtue and holiness than I do. But the ego is a prison, and when that becomes embedded in the fabric of a society, that's the measure of a bad society. I think it was not Fulton Sheen, or maybe it was Frank Sheed, who said something about, very simple, that a good society is one that helps the individuals to be good. And in an egoistic, in a society that enforces egoism and individualism, it's a toxic culture. So, Father, over to you, Father, the expert on this.
As we talk about the dictatorship of relativism and its repercussions in moral life, I come back to my book, which is about to come out later this month, sequel to Dying to Live, and this one is called The Final Exam, Preparing for the Judgment. The first recommendation of the book on the back cover is from Scott Hahn, so it has some good recommendation. But the book is intended to show the objective nature of morality. It is written for non-Catholics. Catholics are going to get a lot out of it too. But it's really fundamental moral theology at the beginning, the whole issue of, is morality objective or is it subjective? And then I speak at length about the natural law and how anybody who espouses belief in something like human rights or natural justice is in fact saying there's a higher law than human law. And I give examples that I think a non-Catholic reader might find acceptable, and that is, if you say everything is relative, then I would say, okay, now under what circumstances would you consider it quite okay for someone to rape your teenage daughter? What? It's never acceptable. Oh, maybe there's objective morality. And then I use another example, something like that. And then the last part of the book takes the reader through the 10 Commandments, where I say this is not Judeo-Christian ethics. This is the natural law in all of the commandments. So we'll see. I hope this book sells as well as Dying to Live. But I made an effort there to show the objective nature of morality. It applies to everyone. Because really, one of the questions that I ask at the beginning, trying to put the question in the mind of the reader, is how is God going to judge me? I think I'm a pretty good person. Is that enough for God? Or does he have some standard that I don't know about? If there is, please tell me what it is so I can prepare. I mean, that's in a sense the background of this whole book. And I said, yes, he does have a standard. And it's not just what we think of ourselves. There's an objective standard, which is nature and the natural law. And on that, he's going to judge us. At the same time, as I explained to someone who came to see me this afternoon, he said, what if you grow up in a culture where cannibalism is acceptable? And then I say, well, that's dealt with in the last chapter of the book, which is called The Final Exam, as is the title of the book, where God will judge us in accordance with what we learned, what we believed when we were growing up. Yes, the natural law is there too, and that in principle always holds sway. But it might be that someone has grown up thinking that some way of living, which is totally contrary to the natural law, is totally acceptable. Well, God will judge them in accordance with that, as he will judge us, and this is a very key point in that last chapter, in accordance with the gifts he has given each one of us, the talents. We all have different talents. Two people can be equally lay persons and Catholics, but to be judged very, very differently because one was given more opportunities, more formation, more good friends, whatever it might be. So anyway, I think the book will be helpful to many people, but morality is objective, and I think that phrase, the dictatorship of relativism, summarizes it perfectly.
I'll have to get a copy of that book, Father Flader. I'm sitting up in my seat a little bit straighter just hearing your summary of it. But I think it is deeply relevant to Pope Benedict's character and legacy as well, in the dictatorship of relativism, but even in the examples you gave about individual talents and living by the natural law. I was struck by the simplicity of Pope Benedict's parents. I think they met through quite a modern means of modern dating or courtship back then. It was through a newspaper advertisement. And I think his father's description of must-haves was quite simple, but, you know, it was virtue was listed in there.
That he had a list of things and
had a few requirements, yeah, and that is striking because in this age of egoism, there's such a temptation for the list of must-haves in your own life or qualities in other people can be endlessly expanding, but his was very succinct and virtue was just right up there. Maybe referring to purity as well, even very specifically. So, and then, you know, they were blessed with a few children, I think 3 children, and then Pope Benedict or young Joseph was born on just before Easter Sunday, or maybe it was even Easter Saturday. Anyway, the interesting point about that is he was baptized.
I believe it was Easter Saturday morning that he was born. Yeah.
And he ended up being baptized very shortly afterwards with the very newest, freshly blessed holy water from that Easter, which is essential to those or important to those liturgies. And so they had a sense there was something providential about this. And lo and behold, he had huge talents, intellectual talents that perhaps his parents had as well, but maybe didn't have the opportunity to grow or develop, but he did. And I think it would be hard to say he didn't make the most of his talents in applying himself for the glory of God. So that's a really good reminder and encouragement for all of us.
Use your talents. Actually, I just brought up the cover of my book. Where do we put it so you can see it? No, here it is.
There you go.
Oh, there it is. The final exam, preparing for the judgment. And it's the last judgment by Michelangelo, which actually is on the wall behind me in the room where I'm sitting. So hopefully this book will be out by the end of January. It's about the same length. It will be the same price as the other one, which is just under $25. So very accessible, plus Amazon and all the other sources of books online.
That's
anyway.
Better than a family pack from McDonald's.
Actually, maybe
the mind instead of the body.
Oh wow.
That's absolutely terrific. And let's speak a little bit about his towards the end of his papacy and his retirement. I mean, he shocked the world when he came out that morning. I remember being telephoned by a friend, and they were in shock. Everybody was in shock that he had resigned the papacy, the first pope in 600 years. We have a canon lawyer in the house here, Father John Flader. How does a pope resign? Is there a set standard for a pope?
That's dealt with in the Code of Canon Law. And to whom does he submit his resignation? And when, for example, he, as Cardinal Ratzinger, wanted to resign as head of the CDF, then he presents that to somebody above him, who is the Pope, and the Pope declined to accept it, so he stayed on, even though he would have liked to retire. But when the Pope resigns, to whom does he present the resignation? And the Pope actually, Ratzinger, no, it was Pope Francis. Pope Francis, just in the last week or so, somehow this topic of resignation came up, and he said, I wrote my resignation letter. It was 2013, so just after he was elected Pope, he wrote a resignation letter. He gave it to the Cardinal Secretary of State at the time, and he said, if I ever become incapacitated, open this letter, and here's my letter of resignation. So it wasn't particular to the present time. It was just a general one in case he became unconscious or whatever. But to whom is he presented? Well, the Cardinal Secretary of State is probably the one to do it. And so I really think, personally, this is just a conjecture, that we will see more popes resigning in the future. And frankly, I would not be the least bit surprised to see Pope Francis resigning in this present year. I think he's not well in health, confined to the wheelchair. Whether he stays until God takes him, which could be any time, of course, but I think he's definitely not well, and that he might resign himself. I don't know, it's a distinct possibility. Someone who knows a lot more, like Cardinal Pell, who is in Rome and sees the Pope and sees Pope Emeritus Benedict before he died. I suspect he might say either I'm crazy, or that's a possibility. But I think it is reasonable. Personally, I think it's reasonable when you have an organization as big as the Catholic Church, 1.3 billion, it's the largest religious organization in the world. And somebody might say, well, Islam is big too, and it may be almost as big, but it's not under one head. When we want to dialogue with Islam, we have to choose with whom we dialogue. Catholic Church is one. It has one head, one body of doctrine in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, one set of sacraments, one liturgy celebrated in different rites, but we are one. It is huge. To run that church when you're 85, let alone older, is a very daunting task. And I think it can become considered to be reasonable for the Pope at some stage to resign. And it's up to him. Up until now in our lifetime, popes have just stayed in the saddle until they died. And Pope John Paul II gave us that witness of staying there when his body had declined, his mind was very, very sharp, but he could hardly speak. His language was muffled a bit, and he was weak, but he stayed there, and he finally passed away on the eve of Divine Mercy Sunday. So that's admirable. But I think for the benefit of the church and the benefit of the person, it would be reasonable, in my judgment, this is just my own personal thought, I think it would be very reasonable for a pope to resign, especially when he gets to an age like 85 or so. And it depends on each one's capacity. Some have a lot of energy, mental clarity, but when the body begins to decline, and if the mind declines with it, as it often does, then I think it's quite reasonable to resign.
And that's a very important point there. Jordan?
I can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I think you're probably right, Father. I think there will be a little bit of a precedent established, and you even see this in the one of the oldest religious orders that's also monarchical order, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem of Rhodes, oh my goodness, it's my own order and I've forgotten it. The Sovereign Military and Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, of Rhodes, and of Malta. So the Grand Master now is not for life. And so he was a head of state, a very unique state without a territory, really, and head of the religious order. But that is now not a lifelong appointment. And so I think that is the modernizing trend. A part of me, though, thinks sometimes less government is a good thing. And if there's someone of a senior generation who thinks, well, we don't really need more change, we're not going to enact a huge program of change, that can be quite an organic and positive form of governance. On the other hand, when the people around a leader who has a very reactionary approach to change are off the leash and unsupervised, then that can be very damaging. So I think it's so important that the Pope and the Vatican is a community, hopefully based on holiness, and that's a topic I'd like to learn a bit more about. Some dioceses even had the idea of, well, they'd be a bit more of a monastic community in the leadership of various dioceses, or bishops would live in community in the canonical life, like St. Augustine of Hippo. And I wonder if we've lost a little bit of that. So for me, I'm not so worried about life appointments as much as what is the day-to-day spirit that animates the leadership organizations, or organizations with leadership responsibility in the church, orders, dioceses, not-for-profits, and obviously the Holy See, most of all.
Now, one of the things that just occurred to me as you're talking there, Jordan, is we're living longer than we used to. And so a person that before, if you look at what was the age of popes when they finished their papacy and died and left us, it was often maybe early 80s, something like that. But getting into your 90s, as Pope Benedict was in his 90s, 95, no one can handle a big responsible job at that age. I mean, that is beyond anyone. If we live longer and we're spared some of the diseases that would have killed us before, then it becomes more reasonable to resign when you reach a certain age. Just as in canon law, bishops and priests, parish priests, are required to submit their resignation at 75. And even then, the secular world might say 75 as the chief executive officer of a large corporation. That's old. Now, there's some people who founded their own companies and they're in that age bracket, still running it very effectively. But I think it's reasonable to ask bishops and priests to submit a resignation, which may or may not be accepted. But I think more and more we'll see that I think it's just reasonable, and we'll see where all this ends. And just a final word from me, if you like, is what Cardinal Pell was saying. We had a seminar for priests at our Kenter Study Center, where, by the way, Pope Benedict lived for 3 nights and enjoyed the cuisine and the concerts that were put on every afternoon. And he found the place absolutely delightful. He said to one of his entourage when they were leaving, "Where did you find this little bit of paradise?" Something to that effect. Anyway, so he was there.
Study center for your retreats.
Yes. So we had a seminar for priests in July. Cardinal Pell was speaking, and one of his words, which I thought was so important right now, and I'm quoting Saint Josemaria, the founder of Opus Dei, who was saying this repeatedly in the aftermath of the Second Vatican Council, when, as Cardinal Pell points out in his recent article, 30,000 priests left the priesthood. Every doctrine was under attack. The sacraments were under attack. And so in that climate, St. Josemaria was suffering with the church, and there in the heart of the church in Rome, and seeing bishops and cardinals from all over the world. He was saying, pray for the Pope and pray for his successor, whoever he might be. And Cardinal Pell was saying the same, pray for the next conclave. Let us take that as a very important message now. Pope Benedict has left us. Pope Francis is not well. Pray for the Pope and pray for his successor, whoever he might be. And always remembering the Holy Spirit guides the cardinals in the conclave. It is not a human institution, yes, made up of human beings with all of our frailty. Cardinals gathering there and having invoked the Holy Spirit in a Mass of the Holy Spirit before they enter the conclave, the Holy Spirit will be active. The Holy Spirit and God will give us the church, the Pope that we need. But let us pray, because that can help the cardinals to make a good decision.
I will dub that the first practical tool of the Catholic Toolbox from Father John. Let's go over to Jordan. What practical tool do you think from the life of Pope Benedict? What is a practical tool that we can take action with from the example of his great life, from your perspective?
I think it's forming the heart and then speaking from the heart.
So forming the heart, that's going to be through prayer.
Through learning from the great minds, following in our fathers and mothers in faith, and then in our daily lives, sharing that. Because I think he was a very evangelizing Pope, really, when you look at it.
Absolutely.
And I would add, just as a final one, perhaps if you want 3, that humility and sanctity. I mean, this man exuded that. He wasn't putting himself forward. He's putting Jesus Christ forward, and he was always in the background himself, even though he was the Pope and the head of the CDF. So just to be humble and put God first, and then holiness, which is love for God, then we will all manner of things will be well if we are a bit more humble and a bit more holy. That's what the church needs, is holiness at all levels.
Practical tool I've drawn after reflection on his life is duty comes first. Duty comes first. He attempted to resign 3 times under Pope John Paul II, and then he finally hoped that his plans were, after finally John Paul II had passed, that he would retire as a Vatican librarian and live a quiet life as a scholar. But then he disposed himself to the will of God, and maybe it's a German thing, following principles and sticking to principles very rigidly. But he stuck to his duty. He followed duty, where his duty called him to lead the CDF, and finally to ascend to the papacy. I've looked at that, as somebody in late high school, and I found great inspiration in that he followed the call of duty. So call of duty. That's how we can describe it. Maybe a false practical tool, but I've had a lot of fun here tonight, reflecting with you gentlemen on the life and legacy of Pope Benedict, Emeritus Benedict XVI, Joseph Ratzinger, who I think will be canonized in due course, God willing. And in the words of Archbishop Anthony Fisher and many people, including Cardinal Pell, that and many people's opinions, that he will be one day a doctor of the Church. Hopefully.
Let's pray for that.
So he never would have wanted that, but good point, and beautifully put, George.
Thank you very much for being with me here tonight, and for those who want to tune in, EWTN and many other platforms are covering the lying in state of Pope Benedict in St. Peter's Basilica, I believe, at the moment. And Thursday, Sydney time at 7:30 p.m. will be the funeral. It will be 9:30 a.m. Rome time, but 7:30 p.m. Sydney time. You'll be able to go online on many different platforms. They'll be covering it, and the funeral will be live there, celebrating St. Peter's Basilica. But thank you for tuning into the Catholic Toolbox, the Art of Practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa. Until next week, God bless, take care, and take action.
In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity.